Welcome to the final lecture in our series, Introducing Psychology. My name's Chris Gall, and of course I wrote the lecture. This time the focus is going to be on the different domains of psychology. And domains really just means that there are subfields within a field. A subfield means a specialty. When people go into a field, they tend to specialize within a given domain. Thus, there are psychologists who specialize in education, those who focus on personalities or biology, counseling or development. There others within the fields of psychology, and we'll introduce a number of them today, and several of them will come up later in the course. So the College Board provided the learning target for today, and that's really just that you can distinguish between the different domains of psychology. So you can tell what the difference is, basically. And so the biological domain is the field that studies the nervous system and the brain and its functions, really. They look at where various functions are located and what happens when the brain itself malfunctions. Clinical psychologists work directly with people to understand how to improve their life. Specifically, they engage in therapy. So clinical psychologists typically specialize in a specific type of therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy or psychotherapy, and they work within clinics or in their own private practice. When students and teachers think about learning, typically they're thinking about memory and how memory works, and that's the cognitive domain. Cognitive psychology focuses on how we remember and what happens when we don't. Okay. The counselors work in clinics, it's true, but they also work in hospitals and schools and in a wide variety of settings. In essence, they help people solve their problems, often by providing guidance of some sort. Counselors can specialize in a wide variety of approaches, and depending on where they want to work, they can specialize in a number of different ways. The requirements to be a school counselor, for example, are different than the requirements to be a clinical counselor. And counselors can also major in fields like social work. A lot of it just depends on the setting in which the counselor is hoping to work. Developmental psychologists focus on how people grow and change across time. They can focus on things as diverse as physical changes to humans, how the brain develops across time, moral development, and things like that. The key point here is that they focus on change across time. The educational domain of psychology has psychologists who work in schools. Specifically, educational psychologists do things like testing kids to determine if they should receive special education services, either because they struggle with learning or because they struggle with boredom and perhaps they need more challenge in a classroom. They help with a variety of services from speech therapy to physical or occupational therapy. They can also provide support to teachers in addition to students by observing teachers in the classroom and providing feedback on educational practices. Experimental psychologists design experiments to try to understand the conditions under which people will act and why they act in the way in which they do. They do this by manipulating the conditions under which people think and act in order to understand how and why people act the way they do. Experimental psychology will be the first domain we cover as the last part of this introductory unit, and then we'll be talking about experiments throughout the course. So IO psychologists, or industrial organizational psychologists, work in organizations to try and help make them work better for both the employers and the employees. They focus on things like whether or not workspaces should be open or have cubicles, whether or not people should work in a team, or how to help teams improve their performance, similar sorts of things. The personality domain is defined by the characteristic sets of behaviors, cognitions, and emotional patterns that evolve from biological and elemental factors. Personality theorists really focus on how to organize those ways of interacting with the world. Okay, psychometricians study the actual how-to of measuring various traits. So they work with experimental psychologists to help figure out the actual measurement pieces of the experiments and help figure out how to interpret the results of the experiment. So they're the folks who create the definitions for how we're going to measure things and things like that. Social psychologists study how we interact with and within groups, how we influence groups, and how groups influence us. If you've ever wondered why riots happen or why you perform better in front of an audience versus how you do in practice, that's social psychology, right? Social psychology also studies things like how peer pressure works. Positive psychologists focus on what's the good life and how to get there. Instead of focusing on how someone's life is not going properly, they focus on what is right and what a person's strengths are and seek to build up from there. We'll touch on this later in the course as well. So, based on this lecture, you should be able to identify 12 different domains of psychology and provide some basic definitions of those domains. As we go throughout the course, we'll run into several of those domains as we're pursuing our study of psychology this year. If you cannot identify and explain the 12 different domains, or 12 of the different domains of psychology, now would be a good time to rewind the video and to rewatch it to fill in any missing definitions. As always, it's been a pleasure talking with you today, and I look forward to talking again in the future.